At my son's wedding, a man asked my wife to dance. My son leaned close and whispered, "Dad, that man called me his stepson for years. I never told you." The next day, I placed the evidence and the divorce papers in front of her, and in that moment, she realized she had lost everything. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. There are nights that begin like the dream of a lifetime and end like the worst nightmare you ever imagined. My son's wedding night was exactly that. The most beautiful moment I'd waited for 27 years turned in a matter of seconds into the definitive fracture of everything I thought my life was. And the cruelest part wasn't what I saw, but the 4 words my own son whispered in my ear while the music kept playing. And no one, absolutely no one in that hall, realized that my world had just collapsed. My name's Leandro Espinoza Carrasco. I'm 54 years old, although there are mornings when I feel 10 years older and others when, honestly, I find it hard to believe I've made it this far. I'm an industrial production supervisor and metal components plant on the outskirts of Zaragoza, a position that no one handed me, and that took me exactly 29 years to build from the first time I walked through that door at 16 as a workshop apprentice. I don't come from a family with money or connections. My father was a lathe operator his whole life, and my mother worked in a neighborhood haberdashery until her knees gave out. They taught me that honest work was the only thing no one could take from you. And for decades, I clung to that as an absolute truth. What no one taught me was that while you're building with your hands, there are those who are silently dismantling with theirs. I keep in my memory an image from when I was 15, listening to my father arrive at 12 at night with his feet dragging, sit in the kitchen, and eat in silence the plate my mother left for him covered with a cloth. Back then, I thought that was sacrifice, that's what real men did. And without meaning to, without realizing it, I became exactly him, that man who comes home late, who eats in silence, who believes that working is proof enough of love. I married Consuelo Vidal Palomares on September 11th, 1994. She was 23 and I was 25. We met at a neighborhood festival 2 summers before, when I was still wearing my work overalls on Friday nights because I hadn't had time to change. She laughed at something I said. I stood there watching her laugh, and that's how it all started, with that kind of simple beginning that doesn't announce anything extraordinary, but that changes your entire life. For the first few years, we were like any young couple in that Spain of the 90s. With bills to settle at the end of the month, with a second-hand car that was slow to start on Mondays, with dreams that didn't need to be big to seem sufficient. Our son Audrean was born in March 1996. I remember that night at the hospital, there was no parking and I double-parked the car. I spent 2 hours worrying about the fine. When a doctor came out and told me it was a boy and that they were both fine, I couldn't care less about the car, the fine, or anything else in the world. I was a good father to the extent that I understood what it meant to be one in that era. Present in the essential, absent in the everyday. I attended all the school soccer games. I missed quite a few dinners. I was at the graduations. I missed quite a few conversations. I'm not saying this to justify myself. I'm saying it because it's the truth and because the listener deserves me to be honest from the beginning, even when that honesty puts me in an uncomfortable position. Consuelo and I had a marriage that from the outside seemed solid. 29 years of shared life built on routines, on a paid-off mortgage, on August vacations on the coast, and Christmases with the same old dishes. There are things that at the time I didn't read as signs because I had no reason to look for them. Now, with everything I know, I see them with a clarity that physically hurts. There was a perfume, one that wasn't her usual, the one she'd worn since we were dating, floral and simple. I started noticing it maybe 3 or 4 years ago, on days with no special occasion, no dinner out or visit to anyone. I mentioned it to her once, almost in passing. "You smell different." Today she replied that she had tried something new at the pharmacy. I let it go. There are things you let go because the fatigue from work occupies exactly the space where attention should be. There was a paper diary. Consuelo always had one of those small ones with a cloth cover that are sold in any stationery shop. For years I saw it on the nightstand or peeking out of her purse without thinking anything of it, but at some point, without me being able to say exactly when it stopped being in sight. She kept it not in a visible place, but somewhere I never looked because I never had a reason to. I let that go too. And there was a single phrase that Consuelo said one afternoon about 5 years ago during an unimportant argument about something I don't even remember. Gregorio understands things that you would never understand. Just like that, with that calmness, I asked who Gregorio was. She told me he was a colleague of her cousin's, someone she ran into from time to time. It bothered me, but I filed it away as one of those comments said in the heat of a fight that mean nothing. I stored that phrase in some corner from which it wouldn't emerge until much later. Audrian's wedding was set for June 8th. We'd been preparing for it for months. My son was going to marry Tamara Castellano Ruiz, a 25-year-old girl from a working-class family in Huesca, direct and calm, whom I liked from the first time I saw her. The celebration would be at a country estate on the outskirts of Zaragoza with 142 guests, a seated dinner, and a live band from 9 at night. I remember that day with the strange precision that important days have. The dark blue suit Consuelo helped me choose 3 weeks before. The dry heat of early June that pressed down from the morning, the smell of the lavender planted along the edges of the driveway to the estate. I saw my son at the altar with his shoulders straight and his eyes shining, and I felt something I can't quite name, a mix of pride and vertigo, like someone closing a chapter without knowing that at that very moment, they're opening a completely different one. I was sitting at my table at 10:15 at night with a glass of wine I'd barely touched when a band began a slow piece. I saw Consuelo get up from her chair. I saw someone approaching her from the right side of the hall. A man of about 56, heavy-set, in a gray suit and with salt and pepper hair combed back, who walked between the tables with the confidence of someone who knows exactly where they're going. I hadn't seen him all night. I didn't recognize him. Consuelo smiled before he said anything, with that kind of smile that doesn't need an introduction because it already has a history behind it. They danced, not in a way that drew the attention of the hall, but with a naturalness that doesn't belong to two people who barely know each other. There was something in the way she rested her hand on his shoulder, something in how he slightly tilted his head towards her when he spoke to her. I don't know how long I watched them. The hall was still full of conversations, of laughter, of children running between the tables. Everything was still the same, and there I was still, feeling something I didn't yet know what to call, but that already weighed too much to ignore. Audrean sat down next to me without my seeing him arrive. He had his glass in his hand and his gaze fixed on the dance floor. He didn't look at me, and in a voice so low I had to lean in to hear him, with his lips almost closed so that no one around could read what he was saying. He spoke to me. "Dad, that man called me stepson for years. I never told you." The glass of wine was still in my hand. The music was still playing. Consuelo was still dancing with him, and I remained completely motionless with the whole world spinning around me exactly as before, while inside me something that had taken 29 years to build was breaking in silence, without making any noise, like things break that no one sees coming. The night of the wedding, I didn't sleep. I stayed seated in the hotel armchair until after 4 in the morning with my jacket folded over the back and the knot of my tie loosened, staring at the wall without seeing anything in particular. Consuelo came into the room shortly after 1, with her shoes in her hand and that light-hearted gesture I had completely normalized after so many years. She told me she was tired, that it had been a beautiful day, that Audrean looked very happy. I nodded, said yes, it had been nice, and she fell asleep in 10 minutes while I was still there with my son's 4 words lodged somewhere between my chest and my throat like something that won't go up or down. I'm not a man of impulsive reactions. I've spent over 3 decades managing breakdowns in the plant. And the first thing you learn in that job is that touching something before you understand exactly what went wrong almost always turns a manageable problem into an irreversible one. So that's what I did that night. I stayed still, organized the little I knew, separated confirmed facts from assumptions, and waited for dawn. I started working at the metal components plant in Zaragoza on March 5th, 1988, at 16, with a vocational training certificate my mother had framed as if it were a university diploma. My father accompanied me that first day on the 6:30 bus. He didn't say much during the trip. When we got off at the stop and I stood there looking at that brick facade with the high windows, he put a hand on my shoulder and said, "In there, nobody's going to give you anything for free, and that's the best thing that can happen to you." Then he left on the next bus for his own shift, and I was left alone on the sidewalk with my sandwich in my bag, listening to the dull thud of the presses that was already seeping out. That Spain of the late 80s was a country changing its clothes in a hurry. The '92 Olympics were already in every conversation. The first bars in the neighborhood were starting to get cable TV, and at the plant, the first management computer arrived in '91, a huge machine with a green screen that took 4 minutes to boot up. It was my job to learn it because the shift supervisor was 58 and declared without the slightest hesitation that he wasn't going to touch that thing. I took the manual home and read it for 3 weeks straight after dinner with the evening news in the background because I understood that whoever knew how to operate that machine would have an advantage. It was the only kind of advantage I could afford. I studied at night for 7 years. Vocational training first, then higher technical modules, then a specialization course in industrial production management that I paid for out of my own pocket in installments over 2 years. While most of my peers were going out on Fridays, I had my notes open on the kitchen table. I don't mention this as a merit, but as a portrait. That's the profile of the man I am, the one who does things slowly, with method, without looking for shortcuts that later cost more than they save. I was promoted to shift supervisor in 2002, to plant supervisor in 2009. Each promotion came after years of night shifts, of phones on at 3 in the morning when there was a line stoppage, of weekends solving what others had left unresolved. They weren't given to me, and every time I came home late and found my dinner saved in the fridge and the house in silence, I repeated the same thing to myself, that all of it was for them, for Audrean, who slept with his door ajar, for Consuelo, who got up early the next day. What I didn't tell myself in those years, and what in that hotel armchair was beginning to haunt me without my being able to avoid it, is that I provided with absolute dedication, but I was only half present. It's not an accusation I make against myself to soften what others did. It's a fact I acknowledge because honesty demands it of me. There were dinners where I arrived so exhausted I barely exchanged 3 sentences. There were entire weekends when the work phone rang more times than any real conversation. Audrean learned from a young age that his father wasn't to be interrupted when he had a frown on his face thinking about something from the plant. That doesn't justify anything that would come later, but it explains some things. And there's a difference between justifying and explaining. When Consuelo and I started dating in the summer of '92, she worked in an administrative agency in the center of Zaragoza. She was orderly, practical, one of those people who remember dates without needing reminders and who are always very clear about where everything is. It seemed to me that we were similar in the essentials. 2 people who valued stability over easy emotion. We got married on September 11th, 1994. Audrean was born in March '96. We signed a mortgage that same year, and I remember listening to every clause with the same attention I read technical manuals, because we were going to be paying for that apartment for 20 years, and I wasn't going to put my signature on something I didn't fully understand. Consuelo squeezed my arm under the table when I finished signing. I saved that small gesture without knowing I was saving it. About 6 years ago, Consuelo started taking weekend getaways with friends. At first, once every few months, then more frequently. Valencia, Bilbao, Lisbon, always with the names of companions I had never met in person, but who didn't raise any doubts for me, because 20-something years of marriage without a serious reason for distrust build a blindness that from the inside doesn't seem like blindness. It seems like security, and security, when it's misplaced, is exactly as blind. I also remembered something that at the time I filed away without processing. About 4 years ago, Consuelo arrived on a Sunday night from one of those trips and left her purse on the chair in the entryway in a way I couldn't describe precisely, but that I registered unintentionally. Perhaps the speed with which she dropped it or the angle of the gesture. I went to kiss her, and she turned slightly, so it landed on her cheek instead of where it was intended. She said she was exhausted. I asked her if everything had gone well. She told me it was great, that they had eaten very well. And that was it. In that hotel armchair, with Consuelo sleeping 2 meters away from me, that image returned with a clarity that surprised me. The memory preserves things that the conscious mind decided not to attend to. It keeps them without dust, intact, waiting for the moment when they finally have a frame to fit into. I didn't know everything yet. I didn't even know most of it, but I already had enough to understand that what Audrean had whispered to me at the wedding wasn't the beginning of something new. It was the visible surface of something that had been growing around me in silence for years. With my own involuntary permission, and what I would discover in the following days would be considerably more extensive than what that early morning was capable of imagining. The day after the wedding dawned with that particular silence of June Sundays, when the heat is already established before 8. Audrean and Tamara had stayed overnight at the estate along with some out-of-town guests. Consuelo went down to breakfast before me, greeted several relatives with kisses and that morning energy of hers that had always been incomprehensible to me, and sat down to have coffee as if the previous night had simply been a wedding night with no more layers underneath. I waited. Audrean appeared after 9. Tamara didn't come down with him. He looked at me from the entrance of the dining room with an expression that wasn't that of a newly married man the day after his wedding. It was that of someone carrying something that weighs more than joy. He made an almost imperceptible gesture with his head, pointing outside. I got up without saying anything, left my napkin on the table, and followed him to the side terrace of the estate, where there was no one at that hour and where the garden sprinklers were running with that continuous, neutral sound that erases conversations. We both stood there with our coffee cups in hand, looking at the garden. Audrean took a while to speak. It wasn't cowardice, it was the weight of someone who knows that as soon as he says what he has to say, something will change irreversibly. I know that silence. I had carried it myself all the previous night. Dad, he finally said, I need you to know what happened, everything. And he told me. Gregorio Fuentes Belmonte appeared in our house for the first time when Audrean was 14. It was a Tuesday night in winter. I was on the night shift at the plant, as I was 3 or 4 nights a week during those years. Audrean came out of his room to get water and found that man sitting on the living room sofa with a drink in his hand, like someone who has been comfortable in a place for a while. Consuelo introduced him immediately with a naturalness that seemed rehearsed to Audrean. He's a family friend, she said, a lifelong acquaintance. I've mentioned him to you before. Audrean swore to me on that terrace that he didn't remember, that his mother had never mentioned that man to him before that night. What followed was not an isolated episode. Gregorio came back, not every week, not with a regularity that would raise immediate suspicion, but he came back, always at night, always when I was working. Consuelo would tell Audrean it was better not to mention it to me, because I came home exhausted and there was no point in burdening me with visits that were, besides, brief and unimportant. Your father doesn't need to know every single detail, she told him on one occasion. Audrean was 14. He had a mother who asked for his silence with that domestic logic that children absorb without questioning, because they trust that adults have reasons they can't yet see. Gregorio wasn't kind to him. Audrean mentioned that detail with a dryness that struck me differently from everything else. He didn't mistreat him. He simply treated him with that polite coldness that people reserve when they consider something or someone a tolerable inconvenience. On several occasions, when Audrean entered the living room and found them talking, Gregorio would interrupt the conversation and wait in silence until the boy returned to his room. One afternoon, Audrean overheard from the hallway as that man said to Consuelo in a low voice, "The boy is always here." Not as a question, as a complaint. The word stepson appeared for the first time when Audrean was 16. It was on an occasion when Consuelo wasn't home and Gregorio arrived without knowing the boy was inside. Audrean opened the door because he thought it was his mother. He found that man on the other side. Gregorio looked at him. Then he looked into the apartment and said with an undisguised discomfort, "Ah, the stepson," without further context, without explanation, like someone using a word they've been using in private for a long time, and that in that instant slipped out into the open. Audrean stood frozen in the doorway without responding. Gregorio came in, sat down, and waited for Consuelo as if he hadn't said anything. My son was 16, and he swallowed that alone. While Audrean was talking to me, I kept my gaze on the garden sprinklers. It was a mechanism I recognized in myself. When I process something very big, I fix my eyes on something small and repetitive. The movement of the water, the turn of the sprinkler, something that demands nothing and that simply keeps working while the inside organizes what it has just received. "Why didn't you tell me?" was the only thing I asked. Not with reproach, with a genuine need to understand. Audrean took a while to answer. Then he said something that I thought about for days. "Because you always came home so tired, Dad. Always so tired." And I didn't know how to start that conversation, and the more time passed, the harder it became to start it. 13 years. 13 years of silence that had settled in layers, each one harder to lift than the last. I don't absolve or condemn him at this point in the story because on that terrace, I didn't either. I listened to him, let him talk, and I was very aware that this boy had been carrying something that wasn't his since he was 14, without the tools to manage it, and without a father available enough for the conversation to seem possible. I didn't tell him that either, because there were things that it wasn't yet time to say. Audrean finished with something that wasn't in the script of what I expected to hear. He turned to me for the first time in the whole conversation, looked at me directly, and said in a voice lower than the rest, "Dad, I think there are more things that I don't know either." He paused briefly. Once, while looking through some papers Mom asked me to keep in my closet when I was 18, I saw something I didn't understand then, a small notebook with numbers and a name. I closed it and didn't open it again. I think it's still in a box in the storage room of the apartment I had before. I did look at him. One name was on it. Fuentes. He said, just the last name and an amount. I don't remember exactly how much, but it was much more than I was handling at that time. I took a sip of coffee that was already cold. The sprinkler continued to turn. From inside the dining room came the voices of relatives beginning to say their goodbyes. Laughter from the wedding still echoing in the air. Unaware that outside that window the world already had a completely different shape. I told Audrean to go with Tamara, to enjoy what was left of that day, that I was fine, I wasn't fine, but it was what I had to say at that moment, and we both knew it. I went back into the dining room, said goodbye to the last guests, gave Consuelo a kiss on the cheek, who smiled at me with that calm expression I had read as stability for 29 years, and which was now something else entirely, and picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. During the drive back home, with Consuelo in the passenger seat talking about how well everything had gone and how beautiful Tamara looked in her dress, I was calculating, not with anger, with method, with that technical coldness that develops when you spend decades identifying failures in systems that apparently worked. Because what Audrean had told me about that notebook with numbers was not a minor detail. It was a clue with a direction, and I knew perfectly well how to follow it. I went back to work the following Monday as if nothing had changed. I entered the plant at 7:15, greeted the shift staff, reviewed the weekend incident report, and shared the 8 o'clock meeting with the same tone as always. No one noticed anything. I've spent too many years learning to separate what happens inside from what I show on the outside for a personal crisis, however big, to filter into the professional environment. That ability, which for decades I considered simply discipline, was going to become, in the following weeks, the most important tool I had, because I had made a decision on the way back from the estate, a clear, cold decision with no room for revision. I wasn't going to move anything until I knew exactly what needed to be moved and in what direction. In the plant, when a failure with no immediate explanation appears, the worst possible response is to intervene on the symptom without having located the origin. I've seen operators turn off alarms without resolving the cause. I've seen how that ends. A process with a hidden fault needs a complete diagnosis before any intervention. What I had in front of me was exactly that type of situation with decades of layers on top. The first week, I dedicated myself to observing without altering any variables in the environment. Consuelo continued with her usual routine. She'd get up before me, have breakfast in front of her mobile, go to her job at the administrative agency 3 days a week, and the other 2, she'd work from home at the study table. In the afternoons, she'd sometimes meet with friends, other times she'd go shopping, other times she'd just be at home, everything exactly the same as before. That confirmed something relevant to me. She didn't suspect I knew anything. She was operating with the same tranquility as always, which meant I had room to move calmly. On Wednesday of that week, I called Audrean. I asked him to find the box from the storage room he had mentioned on the terrace, without apparent urgency, as if it were a minor domestic matter. I told him I needed to retrieve some old documents from the apartment he had before his current one. Audrean understood without needing further explanation. 2 days later, he left the box in the trunk of my car while Consuelo was at work, without any additional conversation between us. That also told me something about my son, that when he wanted to act with discretion, he knew how. That thought gave me an uncomfortable feeling that I saved for another time. The notebook was at the bottom of the box, under folders with Audrian's university notes and some old photographs. It was small, with a dark green cover, with a closing elastic so stretched it barely held. I opened it in the car parked in front of the plant before starting my afternoon shift. The handwriting was Consuelo's. I recognized it immediately, that slanted and neat calligraphy I had always associated with her way of being. There were columns of dates and figures. The oldest dates I found corresponded to 8 years ago. The amounts ranged from €300 to €800 per entry. There was no description written next to any figure, only the surname Fuentes on the first page, underlined once, and below it a note that simply said joint account pending formalization. I stared at those words for a time I couldn't measure. The noise of the plant came muffled from outside. A supply truck maneuvered in the back lot, and its reverse signal sounded 3 times in a row, mechanical and indifferent, while I held in my hands the written record of something that had been building next to me for years. I put the notebook away. I want to work. That night, after dinner, while Consuelo was watching something on the television in the living room, I settled in the study with the excuse of reviewing some production reports. I took out the bank statement from the last 8 years that I kept in a file folder organized by year, because that's who I am, because throwing away financial documents prematurely has never seemed prudent to me. I started with the oldest and worked my way forward with a pen and a blank notebook, noting every movement I didn't remember authorizing or that didn't correspond to any domestic expense I could identify. It took me 3 nights to complete the analysis. I did it in fragments, always with the study door ajar to hear if Consuelo was approaching, putting the notebook in the bottom drawer under some technical catalogs every time I heard footsteps in the hallway. At the end of the 3rd night, I had a list of transfers and cash withdrawals that added up, in round figures and not counting what I hadn't yet been able to verify, to something close to €90,000 distributed over 7 years. Small amounts, for the most part, never exceeding €1,000 in a single operation, with a temporal dispersion that clearly sought not to generate an obvious pattern. Whoever had designed this knew what they were doing, and I knew that Consuelo alone did not have that kind of financial knowledge. That's when I understood I needed someone from the outside. I couldn't continue with this alone. Bernardo Iglesias Montoya had been working with me at the plant for 27 years. He was the maintenance manager, 10 years my senior, with that kind of calm presence that people who have seen a lot and no longer get easily alarmed generate. We had had countless coffees at the machine in the administration hallway. We had solved breakdowns together at 3 in the morning, and we had shared some company dinners where the conversation became more sincere than usual. When Bernardo separated from his wife 11 years ago, after discovering a situation he never fully detailed, but that left him speechless for weeks, I was the only one at work who didn't ask him questions. I just kept having coffee with him, as always. That was enough for a nameless debt to be established between us that neither had yet collected. I called him on a Thursday morning before he started his shift and asked to meet him outside the plant. That same afternoon, in a bar near the Central Market where we didn't usually go, I told him what was necessary, not everything, enough for him to understand the seriousness and to ask for the name of a trusted lawyer. Someone who handled divorces with a financial component and who was discreet above all else. Bernardo listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was silent for a moment with his hands around his cup. Then he told me he knew someone, that he had used him himself during his own separation, that he was a meticulous man, not given to unnecessary words, and that in this type of case, meticulousness was worth more than any other virtue. His name is Ramon Delgado Serrano. He told me, call him on my behalf. Tell him only what he needs to know to get started. And Leandro, he added before getting up, keep everything you have, every paper, every number. Keep it out of the house. That same night, I took out the green-covered notebook and the notebook with my notes. I put them in a large envelope and left them in the locker at the plant that only I could open. The envelope was wedged behind a procedures manual that no one had consulted for years. As I locked the locker, I thought that what weighed on me most at that moment was not the betrayal itself. It was that there was still much more to discover, and that each new layer I lifted was going to cost something that no number on any bank statement could quantify. What I would find in the following days with Ramon Delgado by my side would far exceed what in that plant hallway I was still capable of imagining. Ramon Delgado Serrano had his office in a building on Calle Alfonso in Zaragoza, on a second floor reached by a worn marble staircase that smelled of old paper and varnished wood. He was a 59-year-old man, thin, with thin-rimmed glasses and that kind of calm that isn't learned, but is developed after spending decades reading the worst chapters of others' lives. When I entered his office on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the wedding, he received me without excessive effusiveness or coldness. He indicated the chair in front of his desk, opened a blank notebook, and simply said, "Tell me from the beginning." It took me 40 minutes to tell him the essentials. He listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small, vertical handwriting that barely lifted from the paper. When I finished, he reviewed his notes for a moment, and then said the first thing he said in the entire meeting beyond his initial greeting. What you describe has a legal name. It's called disloyal administration of community property. If the amounts in the joint account are verifiable, there's a solid basis for a lawsuit. He paused. But I need documentation, everything you have, and I need you to understand that from this moment on, you don't move anything without consulting me first. I handed him the envelope with the green-covered notebook and the notebook with my notes. He reviewed it for several minutes in silence, turning the pages carefully, stopping on some figures. In the end, he closed it, placed it on the desk, and looked at me over his glasses. This is a start. I need access to the complete bank statements, and I need a financial expert from my team to review them. What you've calculated by hand is approximate. When we have the exact numbers, the picture will be different. He paused briefly before adding, "It's almost always more than the client initially estimates." He was right. 3 weeks later, Ramon's expert completed the analysis. He summoned me to the office on a Thursday afternoon. Ramon was sitting in his usual place. In front of me was a 14-page bound report. He handed it to me without preamble. I opened it. On the second page, under a heading that said Executive Summary of Verified Irregular Movements, there was a figure written with all the clarity in the world, €143, 620 distributed over 6 years and 4 months in 187 different operations through a combination of split transfers, cash withdrawals, and direct debits to a current account that Consuelo had opened alone and had subsequently operationally linked to a second account of which Gregorio Fuentes Belmonte was a joint holder. 6 years, 187 operations, €143,620. I read that figure twice. Then I carefully closed the report, placed it on Ramon's desk, and stared at the edge of the folder for several seconds. There was a desk lamp on at the end of the table that cast a circle of yellow light on the report. I focused on that circle of light for no particular reason. It's what the mind does when it receives something too big to process all at once. It clings to an insignificant detail to gain a few seconds. Ramon waited in silence. That quality of his, of not filling others' silence with unnecessary words, was exactly what I needed at that moment. When I spoke again, what I said wasn't about the money. I asked him if that joint account could be traced back to its opening, when exactly it had been opened, and what documentation they had presented. Ramon indicated to the expert, who was still sitting to one side with his own notebook, to answer. The man consulted his notes and said that the account had been opened 6 years and 3 months ago at a bank branch in the center of Zaragoza, with the holders present at the time of signing, 6 years and 3 months ago. I did the calculation immediately. Audrean was 21 then. I had just been confirmed in the position of plant supervisor after the annual evaluation. That same month, the three of us had gone on vacation to the coast. I remembered that vacation with a sudden and unwanted precision. The rented apartment near Tarragona, the nights dining out, Consuelo choosing the restaurant every time, me paying without thinking anything of it, because that's how it always was, because that was the natural division of things. While I was carrying suitcases and looking for parking and asking for the bill, she had already, weeks ago, signed the papers for an account I didn't know about. Ramon explained that with that expert report, the complete bank statements, and the handwritten notebook as proof of prior knowledge and continued intent, the case was solid, sufficient to support the divorce lawsuit with cause. With a request for the nullity of the acts of asset disposal carried out without consent, and with a claim for the restitution of the diverted assets. He told me about deadlines, procedures, the need not to alter the domestic situation until the documents were completely prepared. I listened attentively. I took my own notes, and before getting up, I asked for something additional. I needed to know if there was a trace of Gregorio Fuentes Belmonte at any documented family event, photographs, guest lists, any record that placed him at moments I had considered exclusively ours. It took them 4 more days to confirm what Audrean had hinted at without going into detail. Gregorio had been at Audrian's university graduation. I was also there that day, with the camera I bought specifically for the occasion, one of those compact digital cameras that were already starting to replace film cameras in the early 2010s. I remembered that day with renewed clarity, the auditorium, the July heat, Audrean in a cap and gown receiving his degree while I tried to focus from the back row. Consuelo had been moving among the groups during the subsequent cocktail party, greeting people, introducing someone in passing while I was crouching down, adjusting the camera. A man in a dark suit whom she introduced as a colleague from my cousin's work, who also has a nephew graduating today. I stood up, shook his hand, and returned my attention to the camera because Audrean was approaching with 2 classmates for a photo. That man was Gregorio. I had shaken his hand without knowing it. He was also at the inauguration of Audrian's first apartment, the one we bought with the money we had been saving for years, which I had personally negotiated with the bank and whose down payment had come entirely from my savings. Gregorio appeared that afternoon as a friend from the gym, according to the introduction Audrean made, following the script his mother had taught him to repeat for years. He was in that apartment. He drank from the glasses I had bought. He put his feet on the floor I had financed. Each of those moments that I had treasured as family milestones actually had a layer that I never saw. I left Ramon's office that afternoon with the report under my arm and walked for 20 minutes without a specific direction through the city center streets. Not as a way to process my emotions, but because I needed my body to do something while my head finished putting each piece in its place. There was a cafe on a corner with chairs still on the sidewalk, and I sat down. I ordered a coffee that I didn't drink and watched the traffic for a long time. I wasn't crying. I didn't feel the sharp anger that anyone might expect. I felt something more like the absolute lucidity that appears when the diagnosis is final and there's nothing left to wait for or to fear. The problem was identified down to the last component. Now all that was left was to design the intervention, and that, unlike everything else, was territory where I moved with a precision I had spent 30 years developing. There's a difference between knowing you've failed at something and truly feeling in your body. I've been handling figures, documents, strategies for days, the cold mechanics of a legal process that was moving forward with precision. But one night in mid-June, while Consuelo was asleep in the house, was in that thick silence that only summer nights with closed windows have, I sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, where I had started sleeping with the excuse that I got up early and didn't want to disturb her. And for the first time since the wedding, I stopped thinking about her and started thinking about myself. Not about what had been done to me, but about what I had built or failed to build over 29 years. Audrean had said something on the estate's terrace that I had filed away for later, because at that moment, I didn't have the space to process it. I retrieved it that night with an uncomfortable clarity. Because you always came home so tired, Dad. Always so tired. It wasn't an accusation, it was a description. And the difference between the two, which at another time I would have used as a shield, was of no use to me that night. I got up and went to the kitchen. I put water on to heat without turning on the ceiling light, just with the small extractor fan lamp that left the room in an orange twilight. I stood by the window, looking at the building's inner courtyard, which at that hour was a black rectangle with a single illuminated window on the fourth floor opposite. Someone else was awake too. I thought that maybe that person also had something to sort out before they could sleep. I began to review years with the same methodology I had applied to the bank statements, but instead of columns of figures, what I found were absences. The afternoon Audrean had an event at school, and I arrived when they were already putting away the chairs. The Christmas, I worked until December 22nd and spent the 23rd catching up on sleep on the sofa while the house was being prepared without me. The weekend Audrean turned 16, and I was dealing with a line stoppage that no one else could handle. Or so I thought then, or so I told myself then, which is not exactly the same thing. I'm not building a defense for my son's silence. That was made clear on the estate's terrace and has not changed. But there's a question I couldn't avoid that night. If I had been the kind of father a 14-year-old son could approach with something difficult, would he have waited 13 years to tell me? I don't have an answer. I have the question, which is different and which weighs in a way that answers never weigh in the same way. The water boiled. I made an infusion that I didn't drink completely either and sat in the kitchen chair with my hand around the glass until it cooled. There was a moment around 2 in the morning when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Consuelo appeared at the kitchen door with her hair down and her eyes half closed with that disoriented expression of someone who isn't fully awake. She asked me what I was doing up. I told her I couldn't sleep, that I had a matter from the plan on my mind. She nodded without asking more. She went to drink water from the tap, as she always did at night, directly leaning over the sink with that habit of hers that for years had seemed like an unimportant domestic trait to me. Then she turned, looked at me for a moment with her eyes still half open, and said something I didn't expect. "Leandro, you've been very serious lately. Since the wedding," she paused. "Are you okay?" There are moments when a person who has betrayed you says something that for an instant sounds exactly like the person you thought they were. Not because they have stopped being what they are, but because for 29 years they were also that other person at the same time. In different proportions, depending on the day. Consuelo, in the kitchen doorway at 2 in the morning, genuinely worried or acting out the worry with a naturalness that was already indistinguishable, produced a sensation in me that wasn't tenderness or anger, but something more like the vertigo of someone looking down from height and can't help but see both things at once, what's above and what's below. I told her I was fine, that it was accumulated fatigue, that I was going to bed. She went back to the bedroom. I stayed in the kitchen for another 20 minutes. I don't absolve her. Let that be absolutely clear. What Consuelo did has no possible mitigating factor in any of its dimensions. Neither the betrayal maintained for years, nor the money diverted with method and premeditation, nor having used our son as an unwitting accomplice since he was 14. None of that is blurred by the fact that at some point that night, I looked at her and remembered the 23-year-old woman who laughed at something I said at a neighborhood festival. The two things coexist. And I say this because it would be dishonest to present Consuelo as a flat figure constructed exclusively of evil. That would make the story easier to tell, but less true. What I do believe, and I thought it that night with more clarity than ever, is that marriages don't deteriorate all at once. They are emptied in small, gradual amounts that the person inside doesn't perceive the level dropping. I put a lot of money, a lot of work, and a lot of effort into that marriage, but there are forms of presence that are not measured in hours worked or mortgages paid. Forms that I neglected not out of malice, but out of a conception of love I learned from my father, and that in that Spain of the 80s and 90s was the dominant conception, that to provide was to love, that economic sacrifice was the most legitimate expression of commitment. No one told me that wasn't enough. Or maybe someone tried to tell me, and I didn't have my ear tuned to hear it. That night I didn't comfort myself with that. I didn't use it to lighten anything. I looked it straight on, acknowledged it as part of the complete picture, and filed it where it belongs, in the column of what I can't change, but what I can understand. Because there's a huge difference between understanding the origin of something and accepting what that something produced. I could acknowledge my absences, without that modifying by a single euro or a single year what Consuelo and Gregorio had built behind my back. I could accept that I was a father with limits, without that making it reasonable that my son kept that secret for 13 years. Both readings were simultaneously true, and living with that simultaneity without collapsing either in favor of the other was probably the hardest part of everything I was going through. I went back to the guest room around 3. I lay on top of the bed without getting undressed, with my clothes on, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. For the first time since the wedding night, I felt something that wasn't strategy, nor analysis, nor planning. It was simply the weight of 54 years of a life I had thought I knew completely, and that turned out to have entire rooms I was never shown. I didn't cry. I was close, but I didn't. The next day, I went into the plant at 7:15 as always. I greeted the shift staff and chaired the 8 o'clock meeting with the same tone as always. And Ramon Delgado called me that afternoon to tell me that the documents were almost ready, that there was 1 week left. Ramon Delgado explained to me in our next meeting that the process had 2 phases that had to be executed in a precise order and without overlapping. The first was to protect the assets that were still recoverable. The second was the formal filing of the lawsuit. Reversing that order, he told me, would be the only mistake that would have no possible correction. If she gets wind of the lawsuit before we've secured the assets, he explained with his cadence of speaking slowly and in a straight line, there's a risk she'll try to move what's left. Not much, because the joint account will be blocked from the first court order. But there are margins, and margins in these processes always cost. I understood perfectly. It was the same principle I applied at the plant when a configuration change had to be made on an active line. First, you isolate, then you intervene, never the other way around. What followed was a week of silent and meticulous movements that Consuelo never perceived at any moment. Ramon managed the separation of the bank authorizations that I had subscribed to for years on the joint domestic accounts, an operation that was carried out through the corresponding legal channels, without the need for prior notification to the other holder. When there is a documented justified cause, his team's expert had already prepared the formal certification of the financial report with a professional signature, which would have full validity as expert evidence in the proceeding. And a green-covered notebook, along with the original statements and the notes I had prepared during those 3 nights in the study, were deposited in an envelope filed in the document registry of Ramon's office with a date and entry stamp. I also reviewed my will. I had drafted it 11 years ago in completely different circumstances when life had a form I took for granted. I spoke with Ramon about the possibilities within the legal framework. There are limits in Spanish legislation regarding what a father can or cannot dispose of in relation to a child, and he explained them to me with precision. What was completely legitimate was to reorganize the distribution of the freely disposable third, redirect certain shares and specific assets, and leave a formal and dated record of the reasons. All within the law, all documented, all irreversible once signed before a notary. I didn't do it out of anger. I did it with the same coldness with which a process engineer redesigns a circuit that has systematically failed. The consequences for Audrean were not emotional punishment. They were the proportional and permanent consequence of a decision he had made and renewed for 13 consecutive years. If there's one thing that decades of work and industry teach with absolute clarity, it's that systems without real consequences for failures don't learn. People don't either. Bernardo accompanied me to the notary on a Wednesday morning, not because it was necessary for him to be there, but because he offered it the night before without my asking. With that economy of gestures that people who know when presence is worth more than words have. He waited in the armchairs in the waiting room with a folded newspaper on his lap that I don't think he ever got to read. When I came out and we went to have coffee at the corner cafe, he didn't ask me anything about what I had signed. He asked me how I was sleeping. I told him SOSO. He told me that was normal and that it would get better. We talked for a while about the plant, about a bearing supplier that had been late with 3 deliveries, about an early retirement they were considering in the maintenance department. That absolutely ordinary conversation about absolutely ordinary matters was inexplicably one of the things I needed most at that moment. To return for a moment to the normal texture of the days. To remember that the world still had parts that worked exactly as they should. Throughout that week, Consuelo continued with her life without any perceptible alteration. She sent me messages during the day about domestic things. On Wednesday afternoon, while I was signing documents at the notaries, she sent me a photo from a kitchen cladding catalog with a message that said, "What do you think of this one for the backsplash tiles? They say it's very easy to clean." I replied that I thought it was fine, because at that moment it was still necessary for everything to seem exactly the same as always. There was a moment that week when I came close to making the only mistake that could have ruined everything. It was a Thursday night. Consuelo was sitting on the sofa looking at something on her phone with her legs tucked under her in that posture she had always had, and she smiled at something she read on the screen with a small, quick smile that she tried to hide by slightly tilting her head. I wouldn't have noticed it in any other circumstance, but that week, with everything I knew and everything I was carrying, that small gesture produced something in me that I hadn't felt with that intensity until then, a sudden, physical rage that rose from my stomach to my throat in a matter of seconds. I stood up, said I was going to get some water. I went into the kitchen, turned on the tap, put my hands under the cold stream, and stayed like that, with my arms resting on the sink and my head bowed, breathing deliberately and slowly, counting internally. Just as I did at the plant when a tense situation required technical decisions and the body wanted to react before judgment. I was there for 2 minutes, maybe 3. The water was still running. I went back to the living room with the glass. Consuelo hadn't looked up from her phone. Nothing had changed in the room. No one knew what had just happened in the kitchen. And I sat back down in the armchair and resumed the reading I had opened as if those 3 minutes had never existed. But they did exist, and I note them now, because it would be false to present that period as a cold and impermeable execution where I never wavered. There were moments when control was difficult, where the distance between what I knew and what I saw in front of me became compressed to the point of being unbearable. I overcame it, but they were not without cost. On Friday of that week, Ramon called me on my work phone after 6 in the evening. His voice was that of someone who has reviewed everything twice and is satisfied with what he has found. He told me that the file was complete, that the lawsuit was drafted, the expert documentation incorporated, the evidence correctly cataloged, and that all that was missing was my signature on the submission request. He asked me when I could stop by the office. I told him the following Monday morning. I hung up the phone. I sat for a moment in my chair in the plant office, looking out the window at the loading dock where a forklift operator was finishing his shift, pushing an empty pallet towards the warehouse. The dull thud of the presses came from the shop floor as always, constant and rhythmic. The same sound I had first heard at 16 from the sidewalk outside, and that had been part of the background of my life for over 3 decades. On Monday, I would sign, and Consuelo, who at that very moment was most likely thinking about kitchen tiles or the coming weekend or any other thing in a life she believed was intact, had no idea that on Monday morning everything she had built in parallel for 6 years would begin to unravel with the same methodology and precision with which she had built it. Only this time, the one executing the process was me. On Monday, I signed the documents in Ramon's office at 9:15 in the morning. It was an administrative act without drama, numbered pages, spaces marked with an adhesive tab, Ramon pointing with his finger where the signature belonged. The pen I used was an ordinary one, the kind you find in any drawer. I don't know why I remember it, but I do. Ramon told me that the formal filing would take place that same afternoon at the court of first instance, that as soon as the initial order was admitted, Consuelo would receive formal notification through the solicitor, that this process took between 48 and 72 hours from the filing. He asked me if I wanted to wait for the judicial notification to arrive to talk to her, or if I prefer to do it directly beforehand. I told him I would do it myself that afternoon, that I preferred she hear it from me before an official envelope appeared in our home's mailbox. He nodded. He told me it was a reasonable decision and that if she tried to contact him directly, he was not obliged to respond to her until the process was formally initiated. I shook his hand. I went out into the street. That day I didn't go to the plant. I called Bernardo and told him I was taking the personal day I had pending since February. He replied only with an okay, without adding anything else, which was exactly what I needed to hear. I got home after noon. Consuelo was working in the study with the door ajar and the computer on. I heard the sound of the keyboard as I hung my coat in the entryway. I went to the kitchen, heated something without real hunger, ate it standing at the counter. Then I went to the bedroom, opened the wardrobe, and took out from under a pile of folded sweaters the envelope with the copies Ramon had prepared specifically for that moment. The executive summary of the expert report, the statements with the marked operations, and the cover page of the lawsuit with the already assigned case number. I took it to the living room. I placed it on the coffee table carefully, like placing something fragile. I sat in the armchair opposite the sofa with my back straight and called Consuelo. It took a few seconds for her to respond. Then I heard the study chair scrape and her footsteps down the hall. She appeared at the living room door with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and her phone in her hand. She looked at me. She looked at the envelope on the table. She looked back at me. "Sit down," I said without harshness in my voice, without affection either. A neutral instruction. She sat on the sofa slowly, without taking her eyes off the envelope, with that kind of stillness that people have when something in them has already begun to register danger before the conscious mind has fully processed it. I told her that what was on the table was a copy of the expert report that documented €143, 620 diverted from the marital assets over 6 years and 4 months, that the joint account with Gregorio Fuentes Belmonte was identified, dated, and certified by a professional signature, that the divorce lawsuit had been filed that same afternoon at the court of first instance, that she would receive formal notification in the coming days, and that she had a legal period to vacate the marital home, a period that her own lawyer, if she chose to hire one, would specify. I said it in that order, with that tone, without raising my voice at any point. Consuelo didn't move during the time I spoke. She had her hands on her knees and was looking at the envelope without opening it. When I finished, the silence that remained in the living room was of a density I hadn't experienced before in that space where we had lived for so many years. It was the silence of something ending. Then she began to speak. First, she said it was an exaggeration, that there were things I didn't understand, that the figures were taken out of context. I listened. I didn't respond. She continued. She said that Gregorio was a person who had given her something I had never known how to give, that it wasn't anyone's fault, that these things happen in marriages when one of the two stops being truly present. She kept talking. She gradually raised her tone, like someone testing how far they can go before meeting resistance. She looked at me directly and said that I had been absent for years, that I had prioritized the plant above all else, that I couldn't now show up with papers and pretend to occupy a moral space I hadn't known how to maintain. I let her finish. Then I told her that the personal reason she might have did not in any legal or moral aspect modify what the documents on the table reflected, that I could acknowledge my absences and at the same time know, with absolute certainty, that none of my absences legitimized diverting €143, 000 from the common assets with method and premeditation over 6 years. That those two things did not compensate for each other, and that if someone had suggested to her that they did, they had suggested poorly. Silence again. Then came the desperation. Her voice trembled for the first time. She said we could talk about it, that we could find a different solution, that 29 years weren't just thrown away like that I should think about what this would do to Audrean. To that, I did respond. I told her that Audrean was the only reason that conversation was happening in a private living room and not solely through solicitors, that what it would do to Audrean she had decided 13 years ago when she taught him to keep silent, that burden was not mine. She said nothing more. She stood up from the sofa with a slowness that wasn't physical fatigue, but the movement of someone who has just understood that there is no firm ground to stand on. She picked up her phone from where she had left it. She stood in the middle of the living room for a moment, with her gaze somewhere between the table and the window, as if she were still looking for something to say that would change the direction of what had just happened. She didn't find it and left the room. I heard her footsteps down the hall, the bedroom door closing, and then nothing. The house returned to that silence of weekday afternoons that I had known for decades, and that I had never thought could have a different meaning than simple domestic quiet. The envelope with the copies was still on the coffee table, exactly where I had left it, intact, unopened. I sat in the armchair for a good while, not doing anything in particular. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt something much more like the deep, clean exhaustion that remains after completing a very long task that required sustained concentration for weeks. The kind of tiredness that isn't defeat, but conclusion. Through the window came the oblique light of a July afternoon that was being long. A car sounded on the street, and then another. Life outside the apartment continued with its indifferent rhythm. Inside, 29 years had just ended without screams and without witnesses, in a living room with a coffee table and an envelope that she hadn't even wanted to open. I waited 4 days before going to see Audrean. Not because I needed to prepare, but because he also needed time for what was happening to take shape in his head before I arrived to add more weight on top. Consuelo had gone to her sister's house in Huesca 2 days after our conversation in the living room with 2 suitcases and without saying when she would be back. The house was left with that strange quiet of spaces that have lost a usual presence and have not yet decided what to do with the silence left behind. I went on a Wednesday morning. Audrean and Tamara lived in the Actor neighborhood in a 4th-floor apartment without an elevator, reached by a staircase with an iron handrail painted white. Tamara worked at a dental clinic downtown and started at 9. I arrived at 10:15 when I knew she would have already left. I rang the bell, heard footsteps, then a brief silence, as if on the other side someone had reached the peephole and stopped. The door opened. Audrean looked like he had slept poorly for several days. He was wearing an old t-shirt and his hair was uncombed, and there was something in his posture, in the way he held the doorframe with one hand, that involuntarily reminded me of when he was 12 or 13 and knew he had done something I was going to find out about sooner or later. That specific combination of guilt and fear and simultaneous relief that children have when the moment they've been postponing finally arrives. I didn't say anything immediately, neither did he. I stepped aside slightly, pointing inside with my eyes in a gesture that was more a question than an invitation. He opened the door completely. I entered. The apartment smelled of fresh coffee. There were 2 cups on the kitchen counter, one used and one unused. Tamara's, who must have left without finishing. In the living room, there was a folded blanket on the sofa and a book open face down on the cushion, as if Audrean had been there before I rang the bell, unable to really concentrate on what he was reading. I stood in the middle of the living room. I didn't sit down, not because I wanted to mark any distance, but because, honestly, I didn't know if I would be able to say what I had to say from the position of someone comfortable in a chair. There are things that are better said standing still and on your feet, with the weight of your body distributed on both feet, without the support of any backrest. Audrean stood, too, by the kitchen entrance, with his arms crossed over his chest, not defensively, but in the way they are crossed when the cold is internal. I told him that Consuelo had left, that the process was following its legal course, that he already knew the rest or would know it from her. He nodded slowly. Then I was silent for a moment, not for a calculated effect, but because there was something I needed to tell him, and I had been looking for the exact way to express it for days, without it sounding like a sentence read from a paper or a speech rehearsed in front of the mirror. I never found that way, so I said it directly, without wrapping. I told him I loved him, that was not something under review or that would change in any possible scenario, that I was his father and that I would be until the last day, without conditions or nuances in that specific aspect. I paused. Then I told him that trust was different from love, that they were 2 things that could coexist or could be separated, and that in our case they had separated, that he had made a decision at 14, which was understandable, given everything I'd also failed in being available for him. But that he had continued to renew that decision at 15, at 18, at 21, at 25, at 27, that at some point in that journey, he had stopped being a child who didn't know how to start a difficult conversation and had become an adult who chose not to start it. Audrean opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Dad," he said, and didn't continue. The word was left alone in the air of the living room, like something that had come out before the rest was ready to accompany it. I told him he didn't need to answer now, that I hadn't come to hear explanations or to receive apologies, that I had come because it was the right thing to do, because he deserved to hear this directly from me and not reconstruct it through third parties or assumptions. I explained what it meant specifically from then on. The financial support that had existed informally for years would not continue. The part of the assets I had planned to transfer to him in advance had been redirected within the legal framework. There was no date on which this would be reviewed, nor a condition that could be met to reverse it. It was not a temporary measure with room for negotiation. It was the permanent and proportional consequence of something that had also been permanent. I said it calmly, with that same calm I had maintained for weeks, yes, but with a difference that perhaps from the outside was not perceptible and that from the inside weighed in a completely different way. In the living room at home, with Consuelo, that calm was an instrument of precision. Here was the only thing I had left after having exhausted everything else inside. Audrian's voice broke before he spoke. He didn't say anything elaborate or constructed. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." Twice, 3 times, with that repetition that apologies have when the person saying them knows they are insufficient but has nothing else to offer at that moment. His eyes were full. He didn't try to hide it. I looked at him. I really looked at him, without looking away, with all the attention of a 54-year-old man who had been exactly what he was for that number of years. I saw the boy from March of '96 who came into the world while I was worrying about a parking ticket. I saw the 14-year-old boy who opened a door on a winter Tuesday and found something he should never have found and that he carried alone because he didn't know how not to carry it. I saw the 27-year-old man standing by his kitchen with his eyes shining and his hands not knowing where to go. I didn't move, I didn't extend my arm, I didn't hug him, not because I didn't want to, but because there were things that a hug at that moment would have softened in a way that didn't correspond to the truth of what existed between us at that moment. And comforting him with my body after everything it had cost to get to that morning seemed to me the worst possible way to close it. I turned towards the door. I opened it. Before leaving, I stopped for a moment without turning completely. Audrean was still in the same place, with his arms no longer crossed, but hanging at his sides, with that open and defenseless posture that people have when they have nothing left to defend, nor any argument with which to cover themselves. I told him to take care of Tamara, that she was a good woman and that what had happened had absolutely nothing to do with her. I went down the stairs. I went out into the street of Actor with the mid-morning sun hitting directly on the sidewalks and people passing as they always do, knowing nothing about anything, not needing to know. I walked to the car, sat down, put my hands on the steering wheel without starting it yet. There I let my chest do what it had been holding in with clenched teeth for weeks. It wasn't long. It wasn't with a collapse or any visible gesture from the outside, just the weight of what that morning had meant, unloading in silence inside a parked car on a street in Zaragoza, while the city continued to be exactly what it had always been. I started the car 10 minutes later and drove without a fixed destination for a considerable time before deciding where I wanted to go. The judicial process took 4 months from the filing of the lawsuit to the final resolution. For months in which the apartment gradually became emptier of Consuelo's presence. First in the obvious things, and then in the small details one doesn't anticipate. The smell of her perfume that took weeks to disappear from the sofa cushions, the yogurt of her brand in the fridge that I continued to buy out of inertia until one day I stopped in front of the supermarket aisle and left it where it was. Ramon managed the process with the meticulous efficiency that Bernardo had promised me from the beginning. The expert evidence left no room for interpretation favorable to the opposing party, and the lawyer Consuelo hired, a man from Huesca whom Ramon knew by sight and described succinctly as competent, but without ammunition in this case, had very little to work with from the start. The pretrial negotiations were brief. Consuelo was not in a position to negotiate on equal terms, and both parties knew it. The verdict arrived on a Tuesday in October. Ramon called me at my work phone at 11 in the morning with his voice of someone who informs without dramatizing. He told me that the ruling recognized the disloyal administration of the community property as a determining cause of the marital dissolution. That the liquidation of the community property would be carried out with the corrections corresponding to the proven damages, and that the family home was awarded to me in its entirety, given the documentation of the acquisition funds and the proven circumstances of the procedure. The debt that Consuelo would have recognized against the common property amounted, once the legal interest for the period was incorporated, to €158,400. I listened to everything without taking notes. Then I thanked him, hung up, went back to the production meeting I had interrupted for that call, and continued it to the end. Gregorio Fuentes Belmonte disappeared from the scene with the speed and discretion of someone who has spent years practicing exactly that move. As soon as the judicial process became known, as soon as it was clear that there was no property to take advantage of and that his legal situation had his name linked to a file of disloyal administration, he simply ceased to be. There were no statements. There was no presence at any proceeding that was not strictly mandatory. There was no gesture that suggested he intended to accompany Consuelo through what she herself had helped to build. That didn't surprise me. What unites certain people doesn't bear the weight of real consequences. And Gregorio was the type of man who had existed on the margins precisely because on the margins there are no bills to pay. Consuelo stayed at her sister's house in Huesca during the months of the process. I learned indirectly, through a cousin of hers with whom Audrean had contact, that she had resumed administrative work full-time. I didn't speak with her during those months beyond what was strictly necessary through legal channels. There was nothing to add outside that framework that I hadn't already said in the living room of our house one July afternoon. Audrean tried to call me 3 times during the first 2 months. The first time I didn't answer the phone because I was in a meeting, and when I saw the missed call, I decided it wasn't the right time. The second time I did answer. It was a short conversation. He asked how I was. I said I was fine. He asked if we could meet for a coffee. I said not yet. I didn't add when. Not because I want to cause him additional pain, but because I genuinely didn't have that answer. And giving him a date I didn't believe in, so he would feel better for a week, seemed worse than honest silence. The third call I didn't answer. Tamara sent me a text message a few weeks after my visit to the actor apartment. 3 lines. She said she understood what had happened, that she didn't intend to change any decision, and that she wanted me to know that she still considered me her father-in-law regardless of how everything else evolved. I read it several times. I didn't reply immediately. That night, before sleeping, I sent her 2 words. Thank you, Tamara. It was all I had to give her at that moment, and it was honest. At the end of October, I rented an apartment in the San Jose neighborhood, 3rd floor without an elevator, 70 square meters, south-facing, with a window in the living room from which you could see a stretch of street with trees that were already losing their leaves with the arrival of autumn. I furnished it functionally and without excess, choosing each thing without consulting anyone, with the uncomfortable and strange freedom of someone making domestic decisions for the first time in decades without having to consider another person's taste. I bought a reading chair that wouldn't have fit in any corner of the previous apartment without reorganizing everything around it. I put it by the living room window. It was the first thing I saw when I got home from the plant. I had recovered the habit of reading during the weeks of the process, in the early morning hours in the guest room, as a way to occupy the time without the silence becoming too dense. Novels mainly, something I hadn't done regularly since the 90s when shifts in the mortgage and raising Audrean gradually displaced books to a shelf I stopped looking at without realizing it. Now I read them slowly, in no hurry to finish them, with the feeling of someone who has found again something they thought they had lost without remembering exactly when. The plant remained the plant, the noise of the presses, the shift reports, the 8 o'clock meetings, the unforeseen events that always arrive at the worst possible moment. Bernardo had coffee with me the first Friday after I moved into the new apartment and asked me how I liked the place. I said it was fine. He said he was glad, and then talked for 10 minutes about the bearing supplier that was still failing to meet deadlines. And that conversation was also exactly what I needed. Life has a remarkable ability to continue being mundane, even when everything structural has changed. Mondays are still Mondays. The morning coffee still tastes the same. The 7:15 traffic on the access avenue to the plant is still the same slow traffic as always. There's something in that continuity that at other times in life can seem monotonously oppressive, and that in this one I discovered was actually a form of solidity. The world doesn't need your permission to keep functioning. And there are days when that's exactly the kind of news one needs to receive. But the most significant thing about that period, what I didn't expect, and yet took shape with a clarity that grew week by week, was something much simpler than any judicial resolution or any patrimonial consequence. It was that for the first time in many years the time I had was completely my own, with no outstanding debts to anyone, with no accounts to render that were not my own. And that feeling, which at first was almost disconcerting for being so unaccustomed, gradually settled in with the quiet firmness of things that arrive late, but that arrive to stay. There's a question I've asked myself more frequently than I probably should have during these months. Not about Consuelo, nor about Gregorio, nor about the money, nor about the legal procedures, about something more difficult to categorize and even more difficult to answer honestly. The question is this: if that night at my son's wedding everything had remained the same, if Audrean hadn't sat next to me, if that whisper had never happened, how much longer would I have continued without knowing anything? I don't have a satisfactory answer. I suspect for quite a while longer, and that suspicion tells me something about the kind of life I was living that no expert report can reflect. I'm telling all this from the apartment in San Jose, from the chair by the window that I chose without consulting anyone, with the trees on the street below that, now that winter has arrived, are completely bare and have that naked and precise geometry that I've always found more honest than when they are full. Things without cover show their real structure. There's something valuable in that, even if it's hard to get to the point where one can see it without it hurting. I don't present myself as a man who came out victorious from something. The word victory implies a game with winners and losers defined from the beginning. And what I lived through didn't have that clean architecture. There are losses on all sides, including mine. 29 years are too many to be able to liquidate in an assets column without something remaining in the losses column that isn't compensated by any judicial sentence. I lost the version of my marriage that I thought I had. That seems obvious, said like that, but it deserves to be named with more precision. I also lost all the memories I thought were one way and that I now know were another. The vacations in Tarragona, the night in the hospital when Audrean was born, the signing of the mortgage with Consuelo, squeezing my arm under the table. Those moments still exist. They're still real in their material dimension, but they have lost the layer of meaning I had given them. And that loss is not returned by any court. I also lost, at least for now, and perhaps definitively, the relationship with my son as it existed before. That's the hardest thing to say out loud. Not because I fear the judgment of the listener, but because it's the part of this story that still has no resolution, that remains open like a window in winter that you can't quite decide whether to close or not. Audrean exists. He lives his life with Tamara in the fourth-floor apartment without an elevator and actor. From time to time, I receive news of him through the few channels that are still active between us. He has not stopped trying to communicate. I have not encouraged that attempt, but I haven't cut it off completely either. There are things that need time of a quality that cannot be manufactured or accelerated. What I do want to say clearly, and I say it because it seems to me the most important thing of everything I've told, is that the most costly mistake I made over 29 years was not trusting Consuelo. Trusting the person you decide to share your life with is not a mistake. It's what should be. The mistake was building a presence so rigid and so narrow that my own son, at 14, preferred to carry something impossible rather than come and tell me. That is not fixed by the recovered money. It's not fixed by the sentence. It's not even fixed by time, which softens many things but doesn't rewrite them. What it does is stay there in that space where one recognizes their own limits without being able to repair the damage they produced. And learning to live with that discomfort, without turning it into either self-pity or easy exculpation. I've thought a lot about my father during these months, about that man who arrived with his feet dragging at 12 at night and ate in silence the plate covered with a cloth. I admired him throughout my childhood and most of my adult life. Now I see him in a more complex and complete way. He was a man who did what he knew how to do with the tools he had and in the world he was in. I did the same. The problem is that the tools we inherit don't always work for the world we live in. And recognizing that is not betraying the one who gave them to us, but doing the work that they didn't have to do. If there's one thing I would like to remain from everything I've told, it's not the image of the man who gathered the evidence and won the legal process. That's the external form of the story. What's inside is something else. It's the image of a 54-year-old man sitting in a parked car on a street in Zaragoza on a Wednesday in July, letting out what he had held in with clenched teeth for weeks, and then starting the engine and choosing consciously and without drama to move forward. To whoever is listening to this and recognizes themselves in any part of what I've told, whether in the position of the man who worked his whole life believing that was enough, or in the position of the one who silently carried something he shouldn't have carried alone, I say what no one told me in time. Prolonged silence never protects anyone. It only postpones. And what is postponed always arrives in the least chosen way and at the most inopportune moment. Dignity is not what one accumulates during the good years. It's what one is able to sustain when everything they thought was solid turns out to have had cracks long before they saw them. There's an image with which I end. It's not that of the signed documents, nor of the empty apartment, nor of the new apartment with the chair by the window. It's a smaller and more exact image than all of those. It's that of that chair at the estate on the night of June 8th. The chair where I was sitting when the music started, when a man in a gray suit crossed the room with a confident stride and Consuelo smiled before he said anything. The chair where I left the glass of wine I didn't finish. The chair where my son sat next to me and said in a voice so low I had to lean in to hear him what he had been unable to say for 13 years. For a long time, I thought of that chair as the place where something broke. Now I think of it as the place where something finally began to be true.